Now let's turn to the issue of social control. That is, how do we keep order in society? How do we get people to do the things they're supposed to do and avoid doing the things that they're not supposed to do? Now, as we mentioned before, we live in a state society. So a lot of the features of social control are right out there where you can see them. We have laws that are written down, and they tell you a lot of the things that you are and aren't allowed to do. You can't just walk up to somebody in the street and take away their wallet by force. That's a very specific crime. And you can find it listed in the legal code of wherever it is you happen to live. Not only that, there's a very visible set of enforcement mechanisms in the form of police officers and courts and jails and so on. For us, a lot of the restrictions on what you can and can't do are very public and visible. Imagine, though, that you live in a society without those things. Imagine you live in a society without the kind of writing that you can use to put down laws, or the degree of literacy that would allow people to read those laws. What if you didn't have the kind of occupational specialization that lets you have professional police, or judges, or lawyers? That, of course, has been the case for most of human history. The sorts of formal legal mechanisms we rely on are part of state societies, which are something looked at in sort of human historical terms relatively new. By and large, over the last couple of 100,000 years of human existence, people have needed to find other ways to exercise control over social behavior. Now, in most cases, this involves building systems of social control into the fabric of social life, into the things like kinship, religion, subsistence, gender roles, and other aspects of everyday culture. As you follow your roles and obligations as part of a family or a village or a gender, you shape the way that you and people around you find it natural to behave. In most cases, this actually controls human behavior a lot more effectively than courts and legal systems. In kin-based societies, for example, kinship groups are often set up in ways that can help regulate the behavior of the people in them. One of the most commonly seen mechanisms, which I'd like to tell you about a little bit here, is one that was best described by Evans Pritchard in his studies of the New Era, which we mentioned a little while back. It's called segmentary opposition. Here's how it works. Now, the New Era, when Evans Pritchard was studying them, had a largely autonomous political organization that was built around their descent system. Like most groups in the region, they were patrilineal, with a strong emphasis on the identity and the solidarity of patrilineally based descent groups. Now, here is an example of a patrilineal system. This diagram shows 6 generations of a lineage descending from a common ancestor. Now, the first thing you'll notice when you look at this is that the diagram only shows the men in the lineage. There's a reason for that. One is just simplicity. What we're interested in here primarily is the descent relationships, and in the patrilineal system, those go through the male line. If this were a matrilineal system, it would work just the same way, but we'd be looking at females instead of males. Just bear in mind that even though you only see triangles in this diagram, most of these men likely have sisters and wives and daughters who are also part of and involved in the patrilineage. The other reason we only have triangles here is that the kind of processes we're looking at here are ones that mainly involve men. Among the New Era, most fighting and warfare would be done by men, as would things like theft and feuding. There are plenty of social control issues that primarily feature women, but the ones we're looking at right now are ones in which women tend to be less involved. So, look at this diagram for a moment. There's a man at the top, the ancestor of everyone else in this lineage group. He had 2 sons here. One of those sons had 2 sons of his own, whom you can see here, while the other one had a single son. Each of those 3 men had 2 sons of their own. These sons, in turn, had differing numbers of sons, either 1, 2, or 3. Those, in turn, had yet more sons, whom you can see on this lowest level of all. Now, we're going to assume for a moment that the people in this lowest level are young adults, say between 18 and 25 years old. The men at the level above them are their fathers, somewhere in their 40s or early 50s. The men above them are the grandfathers in their 60s and 70s. The next generation up, as you can see, are all deceased. Now, you can think of this lineage as divided into branches, which we can call segments. The smallest segment would consist of a single man and his children. Here are several of them. You could also make a larger segment, consisting of a man, his children, and his grandchildren, like these. And you could go further up the line to larger and larger segments, like these. You can also think of the lineage as a whole as a segment, which would be distinguished from other lineages in the community. Now, the principle of segmentary opposition says that if two people are involved in a dispute, they can turn for help to the people who are within their segment. Suppose, for example, that this man, whom we'll call A, gets into a dispute with this man, whom we will call B. Let us suppose it involves a cow. The New Era are pastoralists who value cattle more highly than almost anything else, and so a lot of their disputes revolve around cattle. Now, suppose B has gone over to A's corral and taken a cow. B says that this cow is one that A owed him from a transaction a couple of years ago, but had never actually paid. A says, well, he paid for that cow years ago and that B has simply stolen his cow. Well, how do they resolve this dispute? Well, the first thing you will notice is that A and B are brothers. They are related to one another very closely, and there is no one who is more closely related to one of them than the other. That means that they will have to work this out themselves. They can't go to the police, there is no police. They can't sue in court, there is no court. They work it out for themselves. How? Well, one option is that they could fight about it. A could walk over with a weapon to B's home, attack or even kill him, take the cow, and go back home. Or perhaps he might try to do that, and B might either fight him off or kill him. That's one way they could resolve this. Now, at the time that Evans Pritchard was studying the New Era, there was no such thing as a police force or a legal code in the area. People had the authority and the ability to resolve these kinds of disputes for themselves. If A killed B, a lot of people might be upset, but there was no formal legal system that could actually punish the action. That said, it wouldn't be a very sensible way to resolve the problem for reasons that we're going to see in a minute. There is a second way, however, and that would be to get someone to mediate the dispute, to get some neutral party who is equally related to both people and so can work out a compromise that they can both accept. Maybe A really does owe some money to B, and they can work it out so that B gives the cow back and A fulfills his obligation, something like that. The key is that the person who works this out would have to be a really neutral party, someone who is not more closely related to one of them than the other. Who would that be? Well, it would be C, their father. Neither one of them is more closely related to the father than the other, so he can serve as a neutral party to mediate. Okay, let's change this a little bit. Instead of B being this person, let's say that he's this person. You'll notice that he is a first cousin to A, his father's brother's son. He takes the cow back to his place. What happens then? Well, just like last time, one option would be for A to go over and forcibly get the cow back. When he did that, he wouldn't have to do it himself. In a system of segmentary opposition, anytime there's a dispute, you always side with the person who is more closely related to you. In this case, these people are all more closely related to A than they are to B. These people are all more closely related to B than they are to A. So A could rely on all of these people to be on his side, while B could rely on these people. Now, when you look at it this way, you can see why we call it segmentary opposition. These two lineage segments are opposed to one another anytime two of their members get into any kind of a conflict. Now, who would be the mediator here? Who is the person who is equally related to both parties and so could serve as a neutral, impartial observer? Well, in this case, it would be Grandpa, up here. He might be able to work out a compromise that would resolve the situation before it came to violence. Like last time, he might propose some sort of payment between A and B that would let everyone save face and walk away peacefully from the confrontation. That's certainly what most of the people involved would want to happen. But remember, he can only negotiate. There's no system of courts, there's no system of laws that can impose the compromise on the parties involved. It will only go into effect if people agree to it. If they don't, they have the right to try and get the outcome they want by using force. Now, in that context, I'd like you to pay attention to the number of people involved. This man here has 3 sons, while this man here has only 2. This means that if it came to a matter of force, A has 3 people backing him up, while B has only 2. That means that B is at a disadvantage. He needs a compromise more than A does, and he may have to accept a resolution that leaves him with the short end of the stick. Okay, let's change it one more time. This time, the cow was taken by this man. B is not a first cousin of A, but his father's 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 brother's son's 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 son. That's a 4th cousin, not too close a kinsman. So, whom can they look to for support? Well, they can look to the people who are most closely related to them. A can rely on all these people, while B can rely on all of these people. In other words, this lineage segment is opposed to this lineage segment. Now, 2 things will jump out at you at this point. One is that the person who is equally related to both of them, this person, is going to have an awfully difficult time serving as the mediator because he's dead and has been dead for some time. There is, in fact, no living person who is equally closely related to both sides. How do you deal with that? Well, the New Era actually had a system for it. There were people known as leopard skin priests, men who went around wearing a leopard skin to identify themselves, whose role was to serve as impartial mediators. They weren't related to anyone in the clan, and indeed, they tended to be kind of marginal people. Their lack of kin relationships allowed them to be seen as legitimate negotiators. Now, the New Era weren't the only people to come up with this kind of system. If you're familiar with European history, this whole system will probably remind you a lot of the feudal system in medieval Europe, which used segmentary opposition in ways very similar to the New Era. In Europe, there was a group of people who were essentially outside the kinship system. They were celibate, with no children, and therefore they didn't have any personal vested interest in how kin-based disputes came out. These were the priests of the Catholic Church. Their celibacy allowed the Church to have an enormously important role in mediating disputes and making peace between rival kin-based lineages, between the fall of the Roman Empire and the establishment of common legal systems in the early modern stage of Europe. They were, effectively, the leopard skin priests of Europe. Anyway, back to the New Era. You'll notice one other thing about this dispute. B comes from a small family. His father had only 1 son, as did his father. Going back 3 generations, nobody in this segment of the lineage has had more than 2 sons. Over on the other side, by contrast, all of the men have had at least 2 sons, and a number of them have had 3. That means that when they call on their different lineage segments, A and B are in very different situations. A has 33 men whom he can call on for support. B has only 9. This puts B at a serious disadvantage. No matter what the leopard skin priest suggests, A may simply ignore it. If he takes his 33 relatives and walks over to B's home, there is no way in the world that B is going to be able to stop him from taking back the cow. A may indeed take 3 or 4 other cows with him along the way, and there's not much of anything that B can do about it. Since you side with your segment in any dispute, the larger your segment is, the greater your ability to make the system work for you. This is one reason why, in societies that work like this, there is a huge emphasis on having offspring, and especially on having sons. Pastoral societies often use segmentary opposition, including societies that you'll be familiar with if you come from a Judeo-Christian background. The Israelites described in the Old Testament were largely a patrilineal pastoral society. That's one of the reasons for passages like Psalm 127, which is attributed to King David. He wrote, "Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them." That was literally quite true, as it was for the New Era and for noblemen in medieval Europe. If your family is your resource, if you depend on the people related to you to protect you and support you and keep you safe, then having children is critically important, not just for you, but for the generations that follow you. B is in a terrible position here, not so much because of anything he's done, but because his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather didn't do their job of producing male offspring. Someone from a lineage like this is going to be stepped on and taken advantage of for all of his life. And as people think about their own families and their own children, they take that into account. So, that's segmentary opposition, a form of dispute resolution you find in various forms in a lot of societies around the world. It's a very different way of resolving problems than the one we use, the formalized system that's generally associated with state societies. It has some advantages and some disadvantages over our system. Now, one of the clear advantages is speed. A and B won't have to wait months for a court date to resolve this problem. They won't have to get lawyers to file motions and wait for judges to write briefs. The dispute will probably get settled in a matter of hours, rather than the months or years it would take for us. Likewise, this kind of system has a tendency to resolve conflicts in a mutually beneficial way. As I say, A always has the option of using violence to try and get his way. But most of the people around him don't want that to happen. In most cases, especially if the lineages are of comparable size, actual fighting does a lot of harm to everyone involved. So the mediator, whether it's a kinsman or a leopard-skinned priest, is going to have a lot of people who are anxious for a fair solution to be found. Now, you will also know that this is a system that's available to anyone. You don't have to have enough money to hire a lawyer. You don't have to belong to the same ethnic group as the local police force. You don't have to have the kind of education that lets you navigate a complex legal system. Anyone, no matter what his background, has the ability to make his case, as long as he has some relatives to support him. At the same time, there are also some disadvantages to segmentary opposition. There's always the danger of violence getting out of control, for example. And people who come from small lineages are in a very weak position. There's also no guarantee of uniformity across different cases. Just because a dispute works out one way today doesn't mean that it's going to work out the same way tomorrow. That can make for a lot of tension and uncertainty, especially if there's some social unrest going on at the time. So there are some areas in which formal systems do have real advantages. One other thing you will notice is that in all the time we've been talking about this cow dispute, we haven't raised the question of who really actually ought to get the cow, right? Who's right in this? That's not the question. That's not the question at issue at all. Coming up with an objectively fair or just resolution of the disagreement isn't the purpose of any of this. The purpose, rather, is to resolve the conflict, to reach a settlement that everyone can live with. That's often a hard thing for people from our society to accept. We value fairness and truth very strongly in our legal discourse. And a system in which those questions don't even come up often strikes us as very unsatisfying. But for many societies, the biggest concern in dispute resolution isn't an abstract question of truth, but a very concrete question of helping people to live together, of healing an injury to the social fabric. What matters is being able to move on, not some philosophical argument about the nature of justice or abstract reality. One last thing I'll mention about a system like this one, or any similar kin-based social control system. It requires a reasonable degree of agreement on basic principles. The New Era system only works if everyone pretty much knows what their rights and obligations are to their kinsmen, and if they are willing to follow those principles. If some people opt out, if some people decide, no, I'm not going to support my relatives, no, I'm going to look at who I think is right or wrong, not who's more closely related to me. If they decide, I want to go resolve things through a court system instead, then the whole system won't work. That's one of the reasons why state societies tend to have formal justice systems, with the written laws and courts and judges and so on. In a society of millions of people, it's very hard to maintain the sorts of common agreement that underlie informal social control mechanisms.